The first thing I want to say about this lecture is that it's not a professional slideshow. This is not a movie or anything like that. So just pretend like you're in class. And I'm there, you're there, and you see these slides. So there's going to be some umming and awing and some incorrect kind of phrasing. I might say the wrong word here and there. But I hope that it's as natural as possible because I'm not going for smooth and shiny. I also want to say that our examination of Plato is not a philosophical one. We're not going to be getting into his subtle understandings of epistemology and so on in this class. Instead, we're doing more of a genealogical examination of Plato and his views specifically on rhetoric. The reason I'm interested in this so-called genealogy is because Socrates is Plato's teacher. Then Plato becomes Aristotle's teacher. And it is from Aristotle that we inherit most of the vocabulary of rhetoric. And I think that Aristotle's rhetoric is very much dependent on Plato's criticisms of rhetoric. Keep in mind the sophists are all around this movement and having a very big impact. So I've entitled this Plato's Gorgias and Phaedrus. Now we are focusing mostly on the Gorgias. I'll just say some brief words about the Phaedrus. You'll notice Conley doesn't go into great depth. The main reason I want to look at the Gorgias is because it is the first time in history, according to Ed Schappa, that anyone uses the word rhetoric. Ed Schappa claims that Plato coined this word. Now, one of the reasons Schappa gains so much in his argument from making this claim is that if Plato coins the word, then he also gets to define it. And Schappa claims that this definition has left us for all time attempting to reclaim the concept of rhetoric. So, the first thing we'll need to do is to think about Plato's view of the world. How does he see things working? Because this gives us a very keen insight into his suspicions about rhetoric. Plato believes in truth with a capital T. Unlike the sophists, who might in some cases believe in many truths or in no truth whatsoever. So capital T truth, i.e. this is a belief-focused, perhaps even quasi-religious notion of truth. His particular truth is labeled divine idealism. Again, I'm not going to get into a lot of subtle distinctions here. There are people much more qualified to do that than I am. But I want to give you some sense of how this view works so that you can understand why he's concerned about rhetoric. So Plato believes that we have a reality that really exists. It's really out there. But on the earth, what we have are appearance. In order for truth to become known, it must be made incarnate. That is, human beings are the repositories for this truth. Now, the problem with the world, as Plato sees it, is that humans have forgotten the truth. And you might remember the myth of the cave. And if you do not remember it, you might want to put in Plato's cave into your search engine and go back and look that up. So humans have forgotten the truth. So Plato believes that the purpose of philosophy, or of dialectic in any case, is that we need to reawaken the truth. How do we awaken truth? Three key concepts for Plato in this sense. First, psychagogia, which is the process of leading and moving the soul. Now, soul is in contrast specifically to the concept of emotion. Soul has a deeper meaning than simply cognitive moving, but it's not just emotional. It's not just making us feel a certain way. Rather, it's a sort of notion of being. It's who we are. So to lead and move the soul apart from emotion. Now, how do we lead and move the soul? In part through anamnesis. You'll notice in that word the roots of mnemonics, that is memory. So anamnesis is stimulating recollection in the soul. We lead and move the soul by stimulating the soul to remember what the soul has forgotten, the truth. Now, how do we stimulate recollection in the soul? Through the method of dialectic. And what is dialectic? Dialectic is the question and answer process. So through dialectic, we ask questions and then we pose answers. So all through his dialogues, Socrates says, "The one thing I know that makes me wiser than all men is that I know nothing." So he posits this untruth, really, as a starting point to ask questions of his interlocutors. And in those answers and questions, he works out a process by which interlocutors and Socrates himself sort out definitions and analyze concepts. So through questions, refutations of the answers, and modifications, we can come up with truth. Now note that these modifications or corrections are what give us truth. For the sophists, there was a sense of synthesis. Someone said yesterday in class the notion of consensus, and that's much more a sophistic notion. That's it. What can we agree on? It doesn't matter if it's true, but what can we work from as an agreement? With Socrates and with Plato more specifically, the notion is more, how do we, through this power of question and answer, modify what we know? Now note that for Plato, language in and of itself is a fairly unstable vehicle. In order to make it powerful, we've got to use this method, or else it can mislead us. So the question and answer does a couple of things. For one thing, questions and answers are exchanged between two individuals. So one of the things Plato says about those individuals is that we cannot really have a conversation with someone unless we know their soul. Hence, one of his first objections about rhetoric is that it's made to large groups. So we have to know the soul of the person with whom we're speaking. It's not an audience, it's an interlocutor. In addition, dialectic is moving. It's constantly in motion. Now, how does this dialectic work? The rhetoricians, Chaim Perlman and I think her name was Louise, I can't remember her first name, Ulbricht's Taitika, say that dialectic works through dissociation. That is, we are defamiliarized with our own appearance or our perceptions of the appearance. So dialectic defamiliarizes one word in order to exalt another. The bad concept has to be redefined in order for the good to take hold. Hence, in Gorgias, we see some of these redefinitions. Again, someone said yesterday that Callicles represents the sort of received opinion. And I think this is a very perceptive observation about Callicles, because what Callicles represents is what the society believes. The good is this particular thing. And Socrates enters to refute that notion and to replace it with a new one. And if we can, through this defamiliarization or through this dissociation, get rid of success as being powerful, for instance, then we might have a chance of making the argument that success is knowledge and truth. Now, the dialogue form is very important, I think, for Plato. In class on Monday, I mentioned the biography, what we might really want to say gossip, that Plato burned his manuscripts upon meeting Socrates because he was so ashamed. The dialogue format mimics speech and is an inquiry model. So it is a teaching process. Now, in the Phaedrus, we see the use of myth, and myth is a very dominant tool that Plato uses. Myths are particularly stories that help us transcend the sort of imperfection of our realities or our perceived realities on the earth. These stories help us rise above our limitations, as opposed to being fictions. So they have more of a religious quality. Someone had asked early on in class about the role of stories and narrative, and then we talked about the poets being thrown out of the Republic. Well, these are the stories that get to stay, the myths, that is, myths that contain truth that help us transcend and come to knowledge. Now, a couple of things about Plato, and we'll see this throughout the history of rhetoric, that technology has an impact on what we believe is true about rhetoric and on our understanding of how rhetoric works. Often it's something that we work in opposition to because typically, historically, society tends to resist technological advances, particularly academics, particularly those in these positions of questioning. Now, lots of others do too. Remember that for Plato, the ability to transcribe words onto a surface where they would stay and remain static is a technology. This is a created way of transcribing and, in Plato's view, imprisoning words. Now, in the letter number 7, which may or may not actually be written by Plato, but is often attributed to him, Plato worries that writing is a technology that will erase memory. That is, if we can write something down, then we don't have to remember it. Keeping in mind that it's not memory per se, or at least in the popular sense, that Plato's worried about. Rather, it's memory in the sense of this anamnesis, this ability to recollect, because he doesn't believe this static writing has the same power as a dynamic process of dialectic, and technology transforms the dynamic into the static. So, put differently, writing will remove words from their home, that is, between you, a specific you, and a specific me, and make them static. He worries that people can, for instance, change what he says and make it say something different, which, of course, the written word is famous for doing. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do for your assignment for this week is I want you to choose each of the characters in the rhetoric. And I've got Gorgias, Polus, and Callicles. And I want you to tell me what definition of rhetoric they represent. And then I want you to tell me what Socrates' definition of rhetoric is in the Gorgias. If you've read the Phaedrus, go ahead and make an attempt at the Phaedrus. Now, keep in mind, just as a final word, what I said at the beginning, that Ed Schappa has claimed, and some have refuted this claim, but I think it's held fairly steady, that Plato has coined this word. If I introduce a word into the language, I get to determine how it's used and what it means. So what is rhetoric for Socrates, and why is it what it is? So again, let's go back to what is rhetoric. So we have Gorgias, Polus, and Callicles, each representing a different aspect of rhetoric. Think about their roles, as we did in class on Monday, and how this might impact their rhetoric. In other words, with Polus, for instance, what happens when you take a young man and give him this incredibly powerful monologic ability to speak? What happens to him? Is he up to that ability? So think of Polus in that naive student way. And then what does that have to say about rhetoric and its concerns or dangers? And then what is rhetoric from Socrates' representation of it in the Gorgias? If you've read the Phaedrus, I'd be curious to know it as well in the Phaedrus. I think it's much more fleshed out in the Phaedrus, but I think the Gorgias sets the stage for the original critique and for the reason why he has to do what he has to do. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. There will be a discussion board for each of the characters, and I'd like you to come up with something that could be fairly straightforward and fairly easy and simplistic for this process. So good luck, and I hope this wasn't too rough and ready. I'll see you next Monday.